Thank you. It's great to be here. I'd like you to imagine if you could go back and live your life as an adventure, would you? Perhaps you have. In the brief time we have together, I'm going to give you a brief glimpse into the life of a Puget Sound commercial diver. The photos you're about to see highlight some of the more exciting and interesting diving venues I've experienced during a 10-year period of my life. Over the years, my older brother has urged me to write an adventure book for young people akin to Jack London about my adventures and miraculous good fortune. This is my first attempt, and if you don't mind, I will read some excerpts from my future book. Like many young men with the urge to try something new, and without the patience for training or reading instructions, I would just jump in head first. That describes my first experience in 1968 at age 17 in a friend's swimming pool in Stamford, Connecticut. After 10 minutes walking around the bottom of the shallow pool with an old steel cylinder under my arm and breathing from a simple regulator, I was hooked. Not the greatest swimmer, this made it easy and comfortable to enjoy the warm water. 5 years later, in 1973, a few of us from college took a needed winter break and drove the 500 miles south down A1A to the Florida Keys. Our goal was to get some sun, drink a few margaritas in paradise with Jimmy Buffett, and try to get a good look at the comet Kohoutek in the night sky. I also brought some borrowed scuba equipment, hoping to get a dive in. After posing for this photo, still without any formal scuba training, one of my friends turned the air on and with a smile showed me the gauge was reading only 400 psi. The cylinder was nearly empty. First lesson, don't ever run out of air. Same goes for flying an airplane, never run out of fuel. This was a lesson learned that would serve me well in the future. Since that moment, over the past 40 years, I have never run out of air underwater. Got lost a couple times, but the good thing in diving is, if you ever get disoriented, you can always surface to get to your bearings, unless you're cave diving or inside a shipwreck, but that's another story. My first motorcycle was a 1970 Norton Commando Fastback, which I scored after trading it for an old 67 VW Bug. I need to tell you this story so you get a better understanding of how my mind worked in those days. The guy that originally owned the bike had crashed it in front of us one evening while a group of us were hanging outside the dorms at school. We all joked he must have been smoking the local riverweed, which had been discovered in the St. Johns River just off the campus the week before. A month later, the bike was back to new condition, and he happened to pull up right in front of the main entrance to the university, not far from where I was, once again, hanging out with a new female acquaintance. I turned to Paul and said, "Nice bike. Too bad he doesn't know how to drive it." You see, I was also an experienced motorcycle rider. I had spent 2 weeks riding a small Honda through the streets of Montego Bay the same year I learned how to scuba dive. Instinctively, I walked up to Chris, who stood about 5'5" with long, greasy hair, and said, "Hey, man, I'd like to save your life. After seeing that stunt last month, you'd be a lot safer driving this Beetle Bug of mine. You can easily turn it into a dune buggy and drive it on the beach." He didn't say anything, but gave me a strange look. I said, "Let me know," and turned around and walked back to where Paula was standing. And now she was giving me a strange look. She said in so many words with her eyes, "If you get a motorcycle, I'm gone." 2 days later, this photo was taken of me driving around campus, and Paula was nowhere in sight. Other than hitting my first home run in Little League, this was the happiest day of my life. The Norton was my best friend through school, and it's the closest thing to flying at ground level. It's been said all too many times, only a biker understands why a dog sticks his head out of a moving car window. Kickstarting a vintage English racing motorcycle and listening to the bark of the engine never got old. I'm sure World War II Corsair fighter pilots must have felt the same way. Having studied oceanography and business in college, 2 days after graduation, I packed up the bike and set out on what soon became an adventure of a lifetime. The Norton looked like a pack mule during the Yukon gold rush with my swim fins, cook pot, construction boots hanging off the back. My dad's Marine Corps duffel bag was packed full and the long box strapped to the side housed state-of-the-art Sears collapsible tent poles. I think the tent weighed over 20 pounds. I decided to go back to the Florida Keys, and it took all night to drive the 500 miles. Having no idea what work I could find, when I arrived, it didn't seem to matter. Once you visited Margaritaville, it never gets out of your system. I arrived at the Big Pine Key Fishing Lodge around 10 a.m., and by the time the tent was set up, the temperature felt like it was 100 degrees. Exhausted but needing to cool off, I went for a ride back over the 7-mile bridge, and halfway across, there was this guy hitchhiking. I had to pick him up, and once we were going, I yelled over my shoulder, "What are you doing out here?" He explained he tried to get a job diving for lobster in the Bahamas, but was having trouble with his sinuses. Hearing that was like a kid knowing a carnival was coming to town. He gave me the address of Pinellas Seafood on Marathon Key, and I was at the marina door when they opened the next morning. The man at the counter told me there was an old Louisiana shrimper named Captain Shack getting ready to go out with his 2 sons, Paul and Robert. So on and off for 10 days, I waited near his boat to see if I could get a job. One early evening, 2 large station wagons pulled up, and they started loading groceries onto the boats. I walked up and asked if they needed an experienced diver. Mind you, my total experience by that time was 30 minutes in a heated swimming pool 6 years prior, and about 10 minutes in a local bay no deeper than 10 feet. There was no response except for, "You gonna help?" The captain must have been debating in his mind whether he would hire me, but I wasn't quite sure. I ran and grabbed my duffel bag, just in case, and waited by the boat, looking like one of our dogs begging for a treat. The thought that they would leave me standing on the dock while they headed for the Bahamas was painful. Low on money, with barely enough to cover the fuel back to Jacksonville, I watched as the captain climbed off this magnificent-looking 80-foot vessel loaded down with lobster traps, and watched him climb on board this weather-beaten 40-foot piece of mackerel boat that had clearly seen better days. He started up the engine, looked at me, and yelled out, "Well, you coming?" I freaked out inside, my heart almost left my chest, and with a giant grin, I jumped on board, was immediately told to store the duffel and release the stern line, and we were gone. I'll never forget the sense of relief and peace of mind as we left the harbor and headed out to sea. Our goal was to catch as many spiny lobsters as we could before we either ran out of food or fuel. But us divers weren't told any of that. The 3rd night out, we suffered an oil fire on board that knocked out most of the electronics, including our therein navigation system. We had a working marine radio, a single 60-watt light bulb for an anchor light, 1,000 pounds of ice, and a 100-gallon propane tank to run the stove and the oven for the duration of the trip. Welcome to the Bermuda Triangle. Our job was to hook lobsters out of the coral heads using handmade hook sticks, then twist the tails off underwater and let the triggerfish eat the heads. We'd stuff the tails in a large net bag and slowly swim to the surface for cleaning, bagging, and freezing. We'd breathe on 100-foot-long reinforced hookah hoses to depths of 30 to 40 feet for 3 to 5 hours every day. We were scared when we saw our first bull shark. Nothing funnier, though, than watching 2 young men hiding behind a 2-foot diameter coral head. Captain Shack made sure his son Paul was my dive buddy throughout the trip. I faked it pretty well. This worked out well for me because I know he'd pay closer attention to the compressor when we were on the bottom. And then there was the ever-present resident 6-foot barracudas on almost every dive. They would swim up to within 20 feet of us and just hover there with their mouths opening and closing, showing their big teeth. But after the first week, they mostly became a part of the scenery. Fortunately, the movie Jaws didn't come out until a year later. Something we didn't anticipate, however, were the waterspouts. I didn't think this boat could outrun one, but they never seemed to bother the captain. He had the saying in his Cajun drawl, "Fine is kind." Translated, that means fine is kind, and would simply turn the boat away if any waterspout got within a quarter mile of us. Just like the Barracuda, though, you never really knew what they were going to do. Every day we were gaining new confidence and soon working as a well-oiled machine. We lived in the open sea for the entire trip, rarely seeing land and occasionally spotting a fast-moving Russian trawler displaying a hammer and sickle on the way to Cuba. Cuban fishermen would appear as well, hand-lining for reef fish to feed their families. This is me about 2 weeks into the trip, holding a couple of what we call shorts, destined for the frying pan, Cajun style, fried in breadcrumbs, butter, and hot sauce. Our hair all turned red, not from the hot sauce, but from washing with Joy dishwashing liquid and being in the sun all day. Plain soap doesn't work in salt water. Like the boys in the story, Lord of the Flies, we degenerated into young savages and made necklaces out of the lobster horns. Unfortunately, the necklaces started to stink so bad the captain made us throw them overboard. He was a good man. Here's a common shot of our back deck loaded with deveined lobster tails soaking in preservative before bagging. This is a rare shot showing the separated lobster heads in the upper part of the photo. For a few days, we took a break and pulled lobster traps off the bottom, so we beheaded them topside. In the upper right, you'll see part of the converted paint compressor with some hookah hose that pumped filtered air down to us. The captain told us the air was safe to breathe because he used squib mineral oil to lubricate the engine and the compressor. After 40 days at sea, I wasn't sure how many brain cells I had lost, but was ready to go home and share my adventures, especially with friends from business school who were flipping burgers, painting houses, and still working on their resumes. We caught 1,800 pounds of lobster tails and were given a check for $450, including room and board, fresh seafood, and diving in warm, clear water every day. Priceless. And my life would never be the same. Fast forward a few years, and I was totally committed to becoming a professional diver. Having earned my master diver scuba instructor credentials, I was managing multi-store dive centers and taking clients on tropical dive trips around the world. It was a tough job, but somebody had to do it. These photos were actually taken in Bonaire, where I proposed to my wife, which is off the coast of Venezuela and representative of the most beautiful marine life seen throughout the Caribbean. Later in my career, I became somewhat of an environmentalist, promoting diver safety, and devised an industry-wide adjunct curriculum to teach divers how not to impact coral reefs when they were on vacation. Having been transferred to Seattle in 1979 to run 2 branch stores for New England divers, I soon supplemented my need for adventure and to help pay rent. I started a subcontracting firm to serve local commercial dive operations in the Puget Sound area. These guys were like musicians and often did gigs together only to turn around weeks later and compete with each other for a local state contract or salvage job. By then, I had acquired many hundreds of hours of dive time and was comfortable diving by myself to almost any depth in any conditions. Being a neutral party, whichever dive company won a contract, I'd get a call to work on the job. I had also mastered the art of living paycheck to paycheck. Many people have asked how one could possibly do this work. They'd ask, "Don't you get claustrophobic?" Absolutely not. unless I got into one of these submarines. There's just no way. This is a cool shot of the mini-sub being lowered into Lake Washington for a test run with Matt Kramer of Underwater Specialists on the top left and Bruce Davies in the background. These were my primary employers when I wasn't working in the dive centers. You'll see more photos of them in a minute. In 1981, along with new friends from the King County Police, we were tasked to find the number plate on a Martin PBM that sank in Lake Washington around 1949. The pilot had missed the dock in the south end of the lake, ran into a hidden underwater obstruction, and punctured one of his pontoons. It soon flipped over and sank to a depth of 80 feet and soon was covered in silt. I was hired to be a safety diver on the job for Mike and Don as they moved inside to find the plate. It was dark and the silt quickly got kicked up, eliminating any visibility. We would communicate by humming through our regulators and tapping on the fuselage. This was a great experience in preparation for the conditions I would soon face in future dives. We were hoping to get permission to help salvage the plane, but the Navy declined our request due to their strict regulations. Turns out this was fortuitous because a number of years later, the Navy decided to salvage it themselves, and sadly, 2 Navy divers were killed in the process, and the plane broke in half. The tailpiece was recovered, but the remainder still lies on the bottom of the lake, covered in silt. In 1982, a small plane had taken off from Boeing Field, flown by a father and his son. The plane had been missing for 2 months when flight log pages were discovered on the shores of Lake Youngs in Renton. Navy divers were called in with high-tech sonar gear and located the plane in 90 feet of water on the bottom of the reservoir. I was now an official member of the King County Search and Rescue Team and was asked to photograph the numbers on the plane and the people on board. I received an emergency call from Search and Rescue and told to grab my gear and get to the lake as fast as possible. When I drove up, there were hundreds of bystanders on the shoreline, as well as the local media. The news carried quickly, and the gyrocopter was warming up, ready to video the story. It seems everybody was waiting for me. As the underwater photographer for the team, no one was to touch anything unless it was first documented on film. I threw on my dry suit, grabbed my camera and the rest of the gear, and ran to the police boat waiting on shore. It was a surreal moment, taking off from shore at high speed with Paul Brendel flying the gyrocopter right above us, filming the effort. We hadn't left the shore but for 20 seconds when I leaned over to my friend Mike Hagan and shouted in his ear over the sound of the boat engine, "I left the film in the car." He yanked the wheel, turned the boat around, and headed back to shore. It was everything I could do to keep from laughing when I saw the gyrocopter make a U-turn and follow us in. I ran to my car with a heavy dry suit on. I'm sure I look ridiculous. Grabbed the film, and we headed out to the marker buoy left by the Navy divers. In the course of 10 minutes, I had gone from nervous to happy, and then back to feeling the stark anticipation of what we were about to do. The 3 of us dropped down just below the surface and were astounded at the clarity of the reservoir. We could clearly see the tiny plane crumbled up on the bottom. It was an eerie, sad moment to find the father and son, after 2 months, still sitting in their seats. An image I will never forget. My experiences were making me a better diver, but I finally figured out I needed more training to get to the next level of my profession. The good thing was my mental game was improving on every dive, and that was the key to pulling off some of the upcoming jobs. Thanks to my new friends Dennis Lucia and Tom Hemphill, I was invited to attend commercial diving school at the Ocean Corporation in Houston, Texas, where I learned more about surface-supplied air and how to really work underwater. There was a statement posted on the entrance of the Highline Commercial Diving School dock in Redondo, just south of here, years ago that read, "The term diver is not a panacea for the skills you lack. It is simply a unique form of transportation." I took that to heart. My next job was safety diver, while the pilot of this bathysphere took photographs of the cables and anchors that stabilize the Hoods Canal Bridge. At 1.5 miles long, it is the longest floating bridge in the world over a saltwater basin. It's held in place by approximately 40 anchors, some that weigh in excess of 3 million pounds, and are attached to thick galvanized cables over 2,000 feet down to depths of 340 feet. When I got to the job site and first spotted the bathysphere, thoughts of 20,000 leagues under the sea came to mind. The owner was an ex-NOAA diver and engineer who restored it to working order. It was capable of diving down to over 1,000 feet if he ever changed out the duct tape he used to plug one of the leaks. My job was to free the bathysphere down to 210 feet if he ever got tangled on a cable or in a rogue fishing net that often floated past the bridge. This is one of my favorite shots, with the pilot, Bruce Davies, precariously floating on the surface with the hatch open. All it would take is one wave. In the distance, you can see the nuclear submarine USS Ohio entering through the bridge. I was called to free the bathysphere one night when working during a slack tide. It was around 2 o'clock in the morning, and Bruce called up to the surface and said he thought he was hung up on something and to send me down. This was a good thing, since I was paid dearly to dive in the middle of the night and extra for every foot down to 100 feet. He was in 130 feet, and I instructed the crew I was going to pull off a gag on him, so to speak, when I got down there. Unfortunately, the gag was on me, and a serious learning opportunity. You see, Bruce had an annoying habit of going through a full package of Oreo cookies when he was down for more than an hour, and it would really bother us when he'd pop out of the hatch and give us a big seafood smile with black cookie crumbs in his teeth. So I thought it would be cool if I swam down and got his attention through one of the portholes and eat one of his cookies in 130 feet of water of 38-degree salt water. I descended into the dark following one of the cables with an Oreo wrapped in a plastic bag tucked under my weight belt, and spotted the bright lights on the bathysphere deep below me. I cleared the entanglement, but nearly choked to death eating the cookie. Never tried that again. Now a full-fledged commercial diver, I was hired to inspect the fish ladders and stilling basins surrounding a number of dams in eastern Washington and Idaho for the Army Corps of Engineers. Our team used a converted World War II-era LCM-8 landing craft to carry our recompression chamber, all our gear, and our compressors. Army Corps engineers would huddle shivering in a small shack on deck while the divers took turns dragging the umbilical we were attached to around the stilling basin while filming with an underwater video camera. The images were being viewed and recorded in the shack. It was in the middle of winter, yet in a neoprene suit with a Superlight 17 helmet, I was warm and dry. Cracking jokes underwater with the topside crew never got old. This is a shot of the backside of the Dworshak Dam in Idaho. It's 717 feet high, third tallest in the U.S., and the tallest straight-axis dam in the Western Hemisphere. When the water crashes down the dam, it often carries debris that could potentially undermine the dam. At the same time the dam was built, engineers designed domino-shaped obelisks and placed them in offset positions at the base of the dam in what's called the stilling basin, which slows the water down and prevents undermining. Our job was to video any deterioration of our basin or the obelisks in very low visibility. Weaving around the obelisks and pulling the long umbilical hose while filming in low visibility was an arduous task. One thing I didn't mention was just before I entered the water, one of the engineers warned us that giant sturgeon lived in the basins, big enough to swallow a diver. He said with a grin, "Biggest one ever caught in the Snake River weighed over 1,000 pounds and was 20 feet long." He wasn't lying. I accidentally brushed against a big one during that dive, scared us both, and luckily did not get kicked by any of the fins. It wasn't one of the 20-footers. On July 29, 1950, 2 divisions of 4 FG-1D Corsairs were flying maneuvers above Seattle on a partly cloudy day when a collision occurred. This is an archive photo of 4 Corsairs similar to those flown that day over Lake Washington. Lieutenant J.G. Ralph Millison was flying in the 2nd position, number 47, let's say, in Division 1, and Ensign Stanley Hayes, position 4, 41, in the 2nd Division. During one of the maneuvers through the clouds, Hayes accidentally flew up into the blades of Millison's plane, cutting into the fuselage behind Hayes' cockpit. They split off, and Millison safely glided his plane down and landed on the surface of the lake. Hayes rode his plane down and somehow managed to safely parachute from around 500 feet. His plane is still scattered all over the bottom. They both were picked up safely. It has been said that when Ensign Hayes returned home to his distraught wife, she said, "Why didn't that Lieutenant Millison watch where he was going?" Can't see much out of a Corsair looking down below you. 33 years later, on August 10, 1983, I arrived at the Sandpoint Naval Station, preparing to search for a sunken World War II Corsair. That's all I was told, and it was on the QT. This is a photo of Matt Kramer stabilizing the recompression chamber as it's loaded onto our crane barge. The chamber is used to safely allow a diver to readjust to normal atmospheric pressure after resurfacing from a deep dive. This was going to be an exciting day. I had a beautiful picture, a great illustration that I borrowed from a NOAA site with their permission, and it depicts one of the NOAA ships dragging behind it a transducer, a hydrophone, if you will, and sonically throwing out sound waves, if you will. It, in a fan-shaped format, it throws the sound waves, and if something hard gets in the way of these, it bounces back to the transducer, transmitting this information to a screen that we're watching on board. After a couple hours and a number of cross sweeps over the lake, an image appearing to be the Corsair showed up on our paper feed. I can still feel the anticipation watching the plotter move up and down on the paper as the image slowly formed in thin slices. And not until you've literally passed the object can you determine what it might be. Often it's a guessing game depending on the angle of the transducer. We marked the spot with a weighted buoy that was to be my downline to the bottom of the lake 150 feet below. My job was to descend the line wearing my bulky dry suit, twin cylinders, and a 45-pound weight belt. I had an underwater light, a handheld sonar gun. I didn't want to scare you with this earlier. And the job seemed pretty straightforward. There was one other issue, though. I had read up on the history of the lake and learned that back in the 40s and 50s, Lake Washington had been nicknamed Lake Stinko in an old Post-Intelligencer article. For 20 years, 11 sewage treatment plants dumped 20 million gallons of state-of-the-art filtered water every day into the lake. Every day, for 20 years, 20 million gallons. I have a thick dry suit on, so no big deal, right? Okay, so I'm on the way down. Dim the lights a little bit up there. It's like mood lighting. Anybody home? It's okay, just pretend it's starting to get dark. So I'm on the way down following the line, and at about 100 feet, the visibility is pretty much gone. The thin polypropylene downline was barely visible and appeared to be breathing due to the onset of nitrogen narcosis. Rarely have I felt that woozy at 100 feet. That's good. At that depth, and with all the weight I was carrying, I was descending pretty fast and needed to add air to my suit to slow me down. I really needed 3 hands to properly juggle all the gear as well as to help equalize the pressure on my inner ears and my sinuses. When I reached the bottom, I could feel my fins dig deeply into the remains of whatever was dumped in the lake since the early 1900s. Pretty creepy feeling, and then everything went black as I kicked up a giant cloud of silt with my hard landing. I needed to gather myself and just feel for the inflation valve on my suit so I could get a horizontal position over the bottom, not lose the downline, find the handheld sonar gun, and get it into the correct position to scan the bottom. This is a fuzzy stock photo of a diver, obviously, in clearer water than I was in, properly aiming this device. Mind you, I cannot see anything. My gear is extremely cumbersome, especially with giant swim fins on. I'm disoriented, trying to adjust to get into the position to make a 360-degree turn horizontal to the bottom. When I squeeze the trigger, the gun sends a conical-shaped beam of sound out, and if something gets in the way, the sound bounces back, and the lighted readout screen on the back lights up and tells me how far away the object is. When I aimed the gun and squeezed the trigger, I was surprised to see it light up, and almost immediately the number 60 showed up on the screen. Wasting no time, I kept the gun aimed at the target and found myself not really swimming above the silt, but through it, kicking silt up like Pigpen in an old Peanuts cartoon. I took a few minutes to move through the thick, muddy bottom when suddenly I bumped into something. I had to force myself to remain motionless and wait a couple minutes for the silt to settle to see what I had run into. Carefully reaching for my light, I turned it on and was startled by the fact I was staring right into the cockpit and gauge panel of the lost World War II Corsair. My heart almost left my chest, I was so excited. With limited bottom time, I quickly marked the plane with the weighted line and swam slowly to the surface, making 2 decompression stops along the way. Now we're going to go back to that imaginary illustration that shows crystal clear water, a boat above, and I'm going to tell you now, describe how the team went about salvaging the plane. You can raise the lights up just a little bit. The Corsair was angled nose down into the deep silt. Due to the weight of the double WASP 2250 horsepower engine, the weight of the plane is nearly 6 tons fully loaded, and this one had been there untouched, or so I thought, for 33 years. Our next diver guided the lifting cable from the topside crane down to the plane and rigged up the appropriate lifting straps. It was later discovered that another outfit had also found the plane. It might have been planning to move it to another location while they got permission from the Navy to bring it up. Apparently, this sort of thing had been going on for years in the lake. Fortunately for us, it made it easier to verify the proper fitting points, the lifting points, and replace the straps, if necessary, to ensure they will hold the weight. We put a strain on the crane, and the plane didn't budge. We needed to jet the mud away from the engine and the fuselage and from around the wings to break it free from the lake's firm hold. The next diver brought down a high-pressure water nozzle and jetted away as much mud as he could until his bottom time was met. One more diver hit the water that afternoon, and still the plane wouldn't move. Maintaining tension on the lifting cable, we slept on the barge that night with the anticipation of diving on the World War II plane the next day. However, at around 3 a.m., the whole barge suddenly lurched, and the plane broke free of the lake's grip, we hoped. I hadn't spent enough time out of the water to make another deep dive, so Matt carefully winched it up from 150 feet to just under the surface in order to check the integrity of the lifting straps. Having determined the straps were holding in pitch dark, we slowly motored the barge towards the Sandpoint Naval Station. We were still fearful one of the straps could go any time. The straps held, and we were able to transfer the plane safely to shore using a larger crane. This is the first official photo of the real plane ever taken after it disappeared below the surface 33 years before. You can see where the treated fabric had fallen away from the tailpiece and the extra line still on the plane left from previous divers. This spectacular side view depicts the approximate angle the plane was resting on the bottom of the lake. What's really amazing, that it took only 18 hours from the moment I swam into the cockpit to the time it arrived back at Sandpoint Naval Air Station. The museum uses this photo on their FG-1D website. It's a great angle. Here I am standing in the blue jacket. It was my plane for about a minute. Here's a shot of our dive crew. To my left is Matt Kramer, Al, Bill, and Gary Larkin with the hood of Air Marine Salvors. Behind me stand Mike Wheatley and his dive partner Chris. Bill, Mike, and Chris, by the way, need to be specially recognized for jetting the plane out of the mud. The work was extremely dangerous at that depth, and all three exceeded their planned bottom time and spent extra time in the recompression chamber, which to me was the most dangerous part of deep water diving. The Sandpoint crew immediately started cleaning the mud out of the engine compartment, and the first stages of restoration began. With the dissimilar metals in the engine compartment, corrosion was significant. This is a photo of a similar plane called the Vought F4U-1A on its way to Hawaii in the early 40s. Unfortunately, it ran out of fuel and landed just off the beach and sank in the salt water. It only took a few years to become a thriving coral reef. Heavy corrosion set in, and it became an artificial reef for algae and invertebrates like barnacles, corals, and oysters. The accumulation of attached marine life in turn provided structure and food for the gathering of fish. Good thing Millicent's plane landed in the lake rather than Puget Sound. The custom Corsair wash continued throughout the afternoon. Here's Gary Larkin eyeing the new prize before the restoration specialists take it away. I took this shot 9 years later in its new resting place in the Great Gallery. It is now a memorial to Lieutenant J.G. Jerome Schuchart, also a U.S. Navy Reserve pilot, who perished in a mid-air collision in 1989. His family raised over $1 million to help pay for the plane's restoration. The finale to my story occurs when the museum's Corsair was still undergoing restoration. I had one more deep commercial dive to make before I moved on to a safer lifestyle, or so I thought. This is a photo of the passenger ship SS Governor before it sank the morning of April 1st, 1921. It was just after midnight as it entered Admiralty Inlet when it was broadsided by the SS West Heartland, creating a 10-foot gash in its side. All passengers except for 8 survived due to the quick thinking of the captain of the West Heartland, who maintained full speed ahead, allowing the 232 passengers and crew to climb on board. Both captains were suspended from their positions. The captain of the Governor died a few months after the collision. In September of 1984, I partnered with Northwest Submersibles in an effort to briefly survey the ship and mark its location. Since 1961, only a small number of scuba divers had dove the wreck and brought up artifacts, so we figured there was a good chance to be the first ones to find the gold. There was a casino on board, and we had read the ship's manifest and learned of a purser's safe potentially filled with $20 gold pieces. Depending on their condition, they could now be worth millions of dollars. So on the 19th of September, 1984, I made my deepest dive to date on the wreck wearing a Superlight 17 hard hat and breathing surface-supplied air. This is the first time since the ship sank that surface-supplied air had been used due to the treacherous conditions. The long umbilical acts like a kite in the wind. It has to have been one of the most incredible dives I had ever made due to the fact I was in over 200 feet of water, and I felt somehow, due to the mild conditions, I was given special permission to be there. The ship is not as safe to dive the other 364 days of the year due to the fast tidal currents and the fact that it lies in the middle of the shipping lanes, which makes it even more dangerous. The large freighters moving through the inlet have very little margin to steer away. I stood on deck for about 10 minutes, surveying the ship in awe. There was 80 feet of visibility, yet small artifacts could barely be identified deep in the wreck. I happened to land on the upper superstructure of the ship, right next to the largest cabezon I have ever seen. Are you God? I thought. I was feeling the effects of the deep water and made sure the topside crew knew I had all my faculties by not saying something ignorant in the headset like, "There's a big fish down here looking at me." The day of the accident, the white pilot house you see floated to the surface and was recovered the next day. Before our group could organize a return trip, in the spring of 1985, two organizations put $140,000 in some of the best divers in the world in order to find the purser safe. My job initially was to assist my friend Stu Lawson, an English ex-Navy diver and dive supervisor, to assemble all the necessary equipment to safely put the divers on the wreck. We built a specialized gas rack so the divers could breathe a heliox mixture, which allowed them more bottom time with reduced narcosis. My primary job, however, was to guide the tug and the dive barge to the proper location in order to drop 3 separate 5,000-pound anchors so the barge could be placed directly above the wreck. The first anchor was successfully dropped, and as the tide was coming in, it brought the dive barge directly over the wreck. All we had to do was pass over the wreck and let the current take it another 500 yards and drop the second anchor, which was accomplished without a hitch. The riggers on board the dive barge then began winching in the first anchor cable, which nearly put the barge directly over the wreck, when we noticed 3 giant C-span woodchip barges cutting across the inlet, not realizing we were at anchor, and in no way we could get out of the way. The woodchip barges had started to crab sideways in the current, and I took this photo just after the first C-span barge missed our relatively tiny dive barge. Our dive barge was 150 feet long. You could hear the deafening sound of the steel cables stretched between the first and second woodchip barge as it scraped along the hull of our barge. The second one looked like he was going to hit, but narrowly squeaked by, but sideswiped it enough to spin our barge sideways, now broadside to the oncoming third woodchip barge. Everything now seemed to be moving in slow motion. The giant woodchip barge slammed into the dive barge at about 8 knots. I captured this right at impact, and you can see the water rise up over the far rail of the tiny dive barge. This was a surreal moment, and everyone was in shock and in disbelief that this could ever happen to us. Tom Hurlin, who captained our smaller crane barge, had gotten all the divers and crew off the dive barge just before the first woodchip barge passed by. After impact, the dive barge was quickly surveyed, needed to be taken into Port Townsend for repairs. It took days to get back out on the wreck, and by then the heavy tidal currents returned, ruining any chance of finding the purser safe. After this episode, I took it as an omen and time to make a change. It appeared my karma had changed, and I needed a new scene. Well, be careful what you wish for. God works in mysterious ways. I got into the business of family and haven't looked back. Here's my beautiful family, all grown up. My kids are now in college, and my wife Carrie and I are trying not to feel guilty having the house to ourselves except for our 3 dogs and a cat. Good thing life comes around full circle. Now I get to do it all over again. Thank you very much. Couple other photos here. I have to make a side note. My wife, Carrie, who's in the back, hi, honey, is a semi-professional vocalist, amongst other things, and she was the president of the local Rotary. And she said, hey, guess what? We're going to have a dinner in the Museum of Flight. I said, no way. I said, where, you know? She said, in some courage wing. I said, the personal courage wing? She goes, yeah. So, not from this standpoint, but a little over to the left, and you all have been there, and about 50 feet back, I position my chair, and Carrie has the great honor of singing Amazing Grace before dinner as I'm looking at my airplane in the back of the museum. Unbelievable. This is a view I took just the other day, and if we can just kind of change the angles a little bit, this is the angle that I came into the cockpit from. So it was a real it's always a heartwarming reunion standing there. Just a beautiful work of art. They did an amazing job restoring this thing. And then last but not least, Flight Squadron 214 with Pappy Boyington in the front. And as you may recall, they're all wearing St. Louis Cardinals World Series caps. Anybody know why? For every 0 these guys shot down, Cardinals would give them a hat. They're all wearing them. Anyway, thank you very much. Thanks, Dan.
I just wanted to say a few words before we close up for the evening. I was going to tell you about the installation of our FM2 Wildcat. Let me just suffice to say that she will be coming down following almost a 50-year restoration from our restoration facility at Payne Field, and will be installed in the first week of April in our personal courage wing. And for our friends and colleagues at the National Museum of Naval Aviation, let me add one aircraft to the list of genuine combat World War II Pacific Theater aircraft to your list of aircraft that you recovered from the bottom of Lake Michigan, because our FM2 is a genuine World War II combat veteran aircraft. My former colleagues at the National Air and Space Museum, when I was at the Smithsonian for 20 years, used to kid us unmercifully at NASM because we were the new science. We were the kids, the new kids on the block. We had only been around for about 100 years. But I like to tell people that what we do and what all of us do here and what we all have in common is we have the first opportunity in the history of mankind to record a human achievement thoroughly. And what we're doing here today and what we're representing in the study of aviation archaeology, even though we are a new science, is going to ensure that 500 years from now, our descendants are not going to have to dig these aircraft out of the sand. And that's what we're all about. It's all a fraternity, we're all colleagues, and we're all trying to do basically the same thing. And I can't tell you what a pleasure it has been for us to have you here with us this weekend to share your stories with us. Thank you so much for coming, and have a safe trip home. Bye-bye.